Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Get comfortable and relax. Story 1, The Truck Stop and the Lizards. It was about 7 years ago, but the memory has remained with me like a shadow that refuses to fade. I've been a long-haul trucker for over a decade now, and in that time, I've heard all sorts of strange and spooky stories shared around diner counters, at fuel pumps, and between idle conversations on CB radios. But this particular night, it still gives me chills every time I think about it. Not just the kind of shiver you get from a cold breeze or a jump scare, no, this was deeper. A kind of cold that sinks into your bones and doesn't leave. I was passing through a particularly desolate stretch of highway in the Midwest, that kind of stretch where the landscape blurs into the same dusty silhouette of distant hills and wire-fenced fields for hours on end. As dusk settled and the sky took on that heavy purple hue of coming darkness, I decided to pull into a truck stop to rest for the night. It wasn't much. A faded sign barely illuminated the lot, a few cracked asphalt lanes, and only 2 other rigs parked under flickering lights, one of those places that looked like it had seen better decades. I parked and began the nightly routine, checking the locks, stretching my legs, and preparing to settle in for the night. The air smelled like hot rubber and diesel, laced with something older. As I made my way toward the restroom facilities, I passed a pair of guys talking quietly beside one of the trucks. Something about their posture caught my eye. They weren't just chatting. They were tense. Their voices were barely above whispers, but I managed to catch a peculiar snippet. Watch out for the lizards. I slowed just a beat. Lizards? I remember thinking, what the hell does that even mean? Maybe it was a joke, some kind of CB slang I wasn't familiar with, or a weird nickname for the cops or rival truckers. I shrugged it off. I didn't feel like engaging, and honestly, after a full day on the road, I just wanted to rest. Still, the way they said it stuck with me, whispered like a warning, not a punchline. As the hours stretched on and the night deepened, I lay in my bunk trying to fall asleep. The world outside was silent save for the occasional hum of a generator or the distant howl of wind. But then, just as I started to drift, I heard it. Footsteps on gravel. At first I thought it was just someone walking by. Maybe another driver stretching their legs or heading toward the vending machines. But the steps didn't sound right. They weren't steady. It was like there were several people out there, but the rhythm was wrong, uneven, shuffling in a way that sent a ripple of unease through me. I propped myself up and peered through the small sliver of window above my bunk. At first I couldn't see much. The lot was dim, lit only by the occasional flicker of overhead lamps. But then, through the murk, I spotted movement, figures darting between trucks. They didn't move like people, too fluid, too low to the ground at times, and then suddenly upright, almost slithering. I told myself it was shadows playing tricks, maybe just tired eyes or animals scavenging for scraps. That had to be it. But something about the way they moved, careful, deliberate, like they were searching for something, made my gut tighten. Then came the knock. A sharp, sudden rap on my driver's side door. My heart leapt into my throat. I checked the time, 12:37 a.m. Too late for anything normal. My hand instinctively went to the lock, already sealed. I called out, asking who it was. Silence. Just a long pause, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps retreating into the dark. I stayed frozen for a few minutes, listening. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. It felt thick, like something waiting just outside, listening back. I tried to convince myself to sleep. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe I'd already been asleep and imagined it. But then I heard something else. A hiss, low and dry, like air escaping a pipe, but closer. Too close. And it wasn't a one-time sound. It pulsed, steady and rhythmic, weaving in and out of the night silence. I pressed my hand against the inside of the door, listening, barely breathing. It was as if someone or something was just out of sight, whispering too softly to make out the words, but close enough to hear the breath. The footsteps returned, this time slower, measured, moving in circles around my truck. At one point, I heard what sounded like nails or claws lightly scratching at the side panels. Not urgent, just testing. Then came a groan, distant at first, then another and another. Voices, strained, croaking, distorted, like someone speaking through water or trying to form words they didn't quite understand. It echoed through the parking lot. Other trucks, I realized, were being circled too. I wasn't the only one. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, the smell hit me. Smoke. But not clean. It smelled like old, burnt hair and wet ash. It drifted through the vents, like it had a mind of its own. I gagged slightly and closed them tight, my pulse racing. I lay there for hours, not daring to move. Every few minutes, a knock would sound on another truck, a screech of something sharp against metal, a whisper that faded before it became words. I could hear engines start briefly, then go quiet again. Were others waking up? Were they too afraid to move? At some point, probably around 4 a.m., I must have dozed off. My last memory was that hiss again, followed by a tapping so soft it almost felt like it came from inside the cab. The first light of dawn broke like a gift from heaven. The lot was still, silent. The figures were gone. I sat up, feeling like I'd just survived a battle. I didn't check for footprints or clues. I didn't want to know. I started the truck and drove off without even checking my mirrors. I didn't look back. I told myself over and over that it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind. Maybe some teenagers messing around. Maybe my own exhaustion painting shadows into monsters. But that phrase, "watch out for the lizards," echoed in my head. Were they warning me? I never saw those two truckers again. I've asked around at other stops, but no one knows them. No one's ever heard of lizards, used in any kind of CB slang either. It's like they vanished, along with whatever visited us that night. Some things just don't want to be understood, and maybe, just maybe, there are things out there that exist in the cracks of the world, between what we think is real and what we can't explain. Things that don't belong, things that travel in the silence of desolate highways and visit only when the world sleeps. Whatever it was, I hope I never see or hear it again. And if you ever find yourself parked alone in some forgotten truck stop with only the moon and the gravel to keep you company, and you hear footsteps that don't sound quite right, or whispers with no source, lock your doors. Don't look out. Don't engage. And whatever you do, if someone ever tells you to watch out for the lizards, Story 2, The Red Dome and the Scroll. It happened over a decade ago, but even now, just thinking about it makes my skin prickle and my heart sink. I was in my early 20s at the time, still trying to figure out my place in the world. Life had already handed my sister and me more than our fair share of strange experiences, and growing up, the supernatural never felt entirely distant. My sister especially seemed to attract things neither of us could explain. Where I might sense a chill in an empty room, or catch a whisper on the wind, she would often see figures, hear voices, or experience things that left her shaking. But I didn't realize just how deep it all went until that night. It was an ordinary visit to our grandparents' house, the kind where nothing seems out of place. A warm meal, light conversation, the kind of peaceful evening that makes you feel like the world has paused for just a little while. I'd moved out a few years before, and visiting home was always a comforting reset. My sister and I were staying the night, her in one room and me in another. That detail, the fact that we weren't sleeping in the same room, would stick with me later, like a sharp tack in the corner of my mind. I drifted off to sleep without incident. The bed was familiar, even if the room wasn't mine. The hum of the old heater, the ticking of a clock down the hall, the occasional creak of floorboards beneath the weight of time, all of it folded into the rhythm of night. And then I began to dream. At first, the dream felt like any other, ordinary, vague. I was lying in a bed, But it wasn't the one I had fallen asleep in. I couldn't quite place the room. The furniture seemed to blur at the edges like watercolor on wet paper. The walls breathed with a quiet intensity. Then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything change, but I felt it. Like an invisible weight dropped into the room. It was like every bit of warmth, every sliver of light, every fragment of joy had been drained, replaced by something cold, something ancient. And in that moment, I was no longer just dreaming. I was trapped. The sensation was indescribable. It was like a blanket of despair had been draped over me. But it wasn't just sadness, it was worse. As if every positive feeling had been scrubbed from my memory. I couldn't recall joy or love or laughter. I was left only with a heaviness, a gnawing emptiness that made my chest tighten. Tears began to stream down my face. I don't cry easily, not then, not now. But in that dream, it was like I wasn't me anymore. I was something small and helpless, caught in a storm without a sky. And then I saw it. The room shifted and I rolled over in the bed, my body heavy like stone. A red dome, glowing, humming, had formed over the bed. It wasn't glass or light or fire. It was something else. Something I couldn't begin to describe. It pulsed with an energy that felt wrong. And standing at the foot of the bed, beneath that dome, was a figure. Tall, silent, cloaked in black. Its face was hidden, obscured beneath a heavy hood. In one of its pale, impossibly long hands, it held a scroll. It didn't speak. It didn't move. But I knew, in the deepest part of me, that it was there for me. I screamed. I screamed so hard that my throat burned, even though in the dream no sound came out. I was consumed by fear, not the kind that jolts you awake, but the kind that digs in and takes root. And then, something happened. My scream became real, loud, raw, shattering the dream like a rock through a mirror. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, still screaming. My dad burst into the room, his face wild with confusion and concern. "Was that you?" he asked, breathless. I could barely form the words, my mind still stuck between the red dome and the reality of my childhood room. I nodded weakly. "Yeah, I think so." He lingered for a moment, then, seeing that I was okay, returned to his room. I lay there for a while, my heart pounding, eyes wide open, afraid that if I blinked, I'd see that figure again. I eventually drifted off again, but it wasn't peaceful. I slept like someone waiting for something to reach through the veil and pull me back under. The next morning, the memory of the dream was still fresh, too vivid, too detailed to dismiss. It clung to me like the scent of smoke after a fire. I found my sister in the kitchen and, still shaken, I opened my mouth to tell her what had happened. But before I could say a word, she stopped me. "I need to tell you something that happened to me last night," she said. Her voice was quiet, like she was afraid of the memory itself. She told me that she had struggled to fall asleep. Something about the room, the air, the shadows made her restless. And then she noticed something. A figure, standing at the end of her bed, holding a piece of paper. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't moved. She had just laid there, frozen in fear, watching it, until eventually she must have passed out. She hadn't seen a red dome. She hadn't seen the figure hold a scroll. But the shape, the posture, the presence, it was too similar to ignore. My blood ran cold. How could we have had the same dream? Or worse, what if it wasn't a dream? What if something had visited us both that night, choosing to appear in slightly different ways? We never got any answers. The figure never came back. The dreams never repeated. But the experience lingered in both of us, a bruise beneath the surface of our lives. There were days I would catch my sister looking over her shoulder, or days when I'd lie in bed, remembering the way that scroll looked in the figure's hand, aged, yellowed, bound by twine, as if it carried names, or warnings, or something else entirely. We talked about it a few more times over the years, quietly, carefully, as if speaking about it too loudly might summon it back. We speculated. Was it a spirit? A manifestation of something deeper? A shared hallucination? None of the answers felt right. And sometimes, not knowing is worse than knowing. It leaves doors open in your mind, doors you're afraid to close, in case something is waiting on the other side. Even now, all these years later, when I close my eyes in silence, I can feel the weight of that night settle on me. I don't know what the red dome was. I don't know what the figure was. I don't know why it came to us or why it left. But sometimes I wonder. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't screamed, if I had let it unroll the scroll, if I had listened. And I wonder if, somewhere out there, beneath the surface of our reality, that figure still waits, quiet, patient, scroll in hand, for the moment when I'm least prepared, when the light fades and I once again lie in bed, too still, too vulnerable, and too unaware that some dreams are not dreams at all. Just echoes, just warnings, just beginnings. Story 3. It was supposed to be just another family road trip, a day of bonding, sightseeing, and travel through the hilly countryside of the Philippines. My family and I had planned it out carefully. We packed food, set our destination in the GPS, and piled into my uncle's large, reliable fortune car. There was excitement in the air, the kind that comes with escape from the ordinary routine. None of us could have predicted what the night would bring, or the strange, unsettling series of events that would follow as the sun disappeared, and the GPS led us far from safety. The first part of the drive was uneventful. The late afternoon sky had begun melting into the soft oranges and pinks of an early sunset. The scenery around us shifted from wide open roads and distant rooftops to narrower paths winding through thick groves of trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and the warmth of the fading sun made the car feel cozy and safe. At some point, exhausted from the earlier part of the trip, I drifted off to sleep in the back seat, lulled by the gentle rocking of the vehicle and the muffled conversations of my parents and cousins. When I opened my eyes again, the world around us had changed. The cozy orange glow was gone, replaced by the eerie dimness of twilight. We were on a steep incline now, the road barely wide enough to accommodate the car's tires. Towering trees surrounded us on both sides, forming a canopy that blocked out most of the remaining light. The air felt colder, sharper somehow. I wasn't the only one awake now. My mum's voice rose above the silence, panicked and urgent. "Be careful, we're going to fall off." I turned my head toward the window and my breath caught. The road, if you could still call it that, was nothing more than a dirt trail edged precariously into the side of the hill. There were no barriers, no signs, no safety rails. One wrong move and we would be tumbling down into the forest below. My cousins and I didn't say a word. We were frozen, too scared to make a sound, as if even speaking might tip the balance. My uncle drove with the kind of care reserved for surgeons. Every inch of movement was measured, calculated. He kept the vehicle crawling forward, inch by inch, his hands gripped tightly on the wheel. It felt like hours passed, though it was probably only minutes, until finally we reached a clearing, a slightly wider area of the road where we could turn around. It was still partway up the hill, but it was enough. My uncle reversed slowly, cautiously, until the car was pointed back toward the path we had come from. He didn't say much, just pressed his foot gently on the gas, steering us back to the main road with the kind of quiet urgency that only comes when fear has passed but hasn't yet left. When we finally reached flat ground again, the silence in the car was deafening. We were shaken, rattled. There was a tension in the air, like everyone was too afraid to speak about what had just happened. My mum was still catching her breath, and my cousins stared out the windows, eyes wide and unfocused. But we were safe, for the moment. The sun had fully disappeared by then. The sky outside had become a thick, impenetrable black. There were no streetlights, no other vehicles, just darkness, trees, and the quiet rumble of the car engine. This time, we didn't rely on the GPS. My uncle remembered taking a different route years ago and decided to trust his memory instead. He seemed confident even if the rest of us weren't. We followed a gravel path crunching under the wheels like old bones and began ascending another hill. It felt familiar to him, but unfamiliar to the rest of us. The air grew colder, the trees more numerous, and still there were no signs of life anywhere. Eventually the car came to a stop, not abruptly but with a strange hesitant stillness, as if the road itself had run out of breath. My uncle sat silently behind the wheel. The headlights revealed nothing but more trees ahead, no signs, no trails, no indication that the road continued. Just black earth and scattered stones. Confused, my mum asked what was wrong. My uncle didn't answer at first, just opened the driver's door and stepped outside. The cold hit us immediately. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the kind of chill that creeps under your skin and whispers in your ear. The wind was strong, weaving through the trees with a voice of its own. We sat frozen, listening as it whistled around us, brushing against the windows like invisible fingers. My cousins and I huddled together in the back seat, unsure of what was happening but unwilling to ask. And then, my uncle turned on the car's high beams. What we saw next is something I still cannot explain. In the clearing ahead of us, standing in perfect silence, was a line of people. Dozens of them, maybe more. They weren't doing anything. Just standing, not moving, not talking, not reacting to the sudden burst of light that illuminated their faces. And that was the strangest part. There were no details. Their features blurred, indistinct, like the outlines of people rather than people themselves, as if they had been drawn hastily and forgotten halfway through. Some were tall, others short, some hunched or cloaked, and yet they all faced the car, every single one of them. No one in the car moved, not a breath, not a whisper. I remember the feeling in my stomach, the kind of dread that sits heavy and doesn't budge. It wasn't fear like the kind you feel during a horror movie. It was something older, primal, the kind of instinctual terror that made every hair on my body stand on end. My uncle said nothing. He just slowly reversed the car, never taking his eyes off the road, or them. Once we were far enough from the clearing, he turned the car around and drove back the way we came. No one dared ask questions. There were none to ask. And I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was too afraid that they would still be standing there, still watching, or worse, following. At some point during the drive, I must have fallen asleep again. Maybe it was the shock. Maybe it was my body's way of protecting itself. When I woke up, we were parked outside a small 7-Eleven near the edge of the town we had originally left. It was bright, noisy, familiar. The buzzing of fluorescent lights, the scent of hot dogs and instant noodles. It was like waking from a nightmare into the safety of the mundane. We hadn't eaten all day. Everyone was starving, exhausted, drained. I remember biting into a hot dog and not even tasting it. The adrenaline had long since faded, but the memory stayed behind. Heavy and strange, lingering like a scent that doesn't wash out. We never found out what happened. The GPS had led us astray, sure, but roads don't just vanish. And people, normal people, don't just stand silently in the woods at night in perfect formation. We tried to rationalize it, of course. Maybe it was a ceremony, some kind of remote gathering. Maybe we'd stumbled into a secluded area where locals held nighttime events. But there were no torches, no fires, no music, no noise, just silence and figures and cold. In the days that followed, I thought about it constantly. I replayed every moment, every movement. I even looked online for any explanation, any similar experiences, but I found nothing. Just urban legends and stories with more fiction than fact. What were they doing there? Why didn't they move? Why didn't they say anything? I still don't know. I probably never will. But what I do know is this. The GPS wasn't just wrong. It didn't just mislead us. It took us somewhere we weren't meant to go. Somewhere off the map, not just geographically but spiritually, a place that feels like it exists in the cracks between one world and the next. And if you ever find yourself climbing a hill in the dark, guided only by the blind faith of a glowing blue screen, take a moment, look around, listen, because there are places that don't welcome visitors, places that feel old and watchful, places that don't want you there, not because you're unwelcome, but because your presence breaks some rule you're not meant to know exists. We never spoke much about it after that night. My family likes to laugh about it now, chalking it up to bad navigation and an overactive imagination. But I remember my mother's voice as we drove that narrow ridge. I remember the silence in the car. I remember the figures in the trees. And most of all, I remember the cold. Story 4. The armed strangers at the house. It happened during one of those quiet, unassuming afternoons. I was 20 years old, living in a rural part of the country where houses were far apart and silence was the usual soundtrack of the day. The kind of place where time moved slower, where people still waved to each other from passing trucks, and where a sense of calm usually hung thick in the air like morning fog. My family owned a house on a few acres of land, set back from the road and framed by open fields and clusters of trees. It was the kind of home that felt safe simply because it was far removed from everything else. That particular day, I was home with one of my best friends from high school. He was 18 then and had been living with us for a while. We were both enjoying the solitude. It was the kind of arrangement that worked well. We played games, messed around in the garage, and enjoyed the kind of idle freedom you only get in your late teens and early 20s. Importantly, on that day there were no cars in the driveway, which meant that from the road, our house looked empty. My friend, let's call him Adam, was one of those guys you'd underestimate at first glance. Short, skinny, baby-faced, he looked like he could still be in middle school, but he was scrappy and smart and could hold his own. That mattered more than anything else that afternoon. It started with the sound of gravel crunching, tires on our long, unpaved driveway. Not an unusual sound, but rare enough that it caught my attention immediately. We didn't have many visitors, and anyone who knew us well would have called ahead or just waited out front. I peered through the living room blinds, narrowing the slats with 2 fingers. A truck had pulled up, a lifted grey quad cab with one of those rough-patched jobs where a company logo might have once been. It had a spot of white primer on the door, just enough to catch the eye. I didn't recognize the vehicle, and worse, I didn't recognize the 3 men who got out of it. 3. They moved with intent. One of them, the driver, had a holstered semi-automatic on his hip. That was the first thing that sent alarm bells ringing in my chest. This wasn't just a casual drop-in or a mistaken address. And to make matters worse, they had clearly ignored the prominent sign we had posted near the entrance to our driveway. No trespassing, no soliciting, violators may be shot. A bit dramatic, sure, but it was rural tradition and it had always kept strangers away. Until now. I didn't panic right away. I watched, observed, tried to make sense of what was happening. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they were local ranchers stopping by to ask about cattle, fencing, or some other matter, but nothing about the way they moved said neighborly. They looked around, scanning the property, their eyes never staying still for long. Meanwhile, Adam was around back, working on a makeshift forge we'd set up. He'd been trying his hand at blacksmithing, heating and shaping metal with a homemade charcoal setup. He must have heard the vehicle as well, because he came walking around the side of the house. I watched him as he spotted the men, and instantly changed the way he held the hammer in his hand. Not like a tool, but like a weapon, raised slightly, angled for a swift throw or a defensive block. That told me all I needed to know. He didn't know them either, and that meant danger. Without hesitation, I grabbed the deer rifle that was sitting on the coffee table. I know it wasn't the best place to keep a firearm, but out here it wasn't unusual. I slammed a single round into the chamber and pointed it through the blinds, angling it toward the man with the gun. I didn't want to fire. I didn't want it to come to that, but I needed to be ready. From Adam's perspective, this is what happened. One of the men stepped forward, trying to appear casual. "Hey there, kid," he said. "Are your parents home?" It was a strange way to start the conversation, Adam was clearly old enough to not be a kid, but the tone was deliberate, disarming, patronizing. Adam answered without hesitation, with some local ranchers going door to door selling fresh cuts. The man said next. Well, that was the pitch, the excuse, but it didn't make sense. Who drives onto private land, past signs warning of danger, to sell meat? Who carries a visible firearm while doing so? And more importantly, who tries to sell to a house that looks clearly unoccupied? Adam played it cool. My dad's inside, getting ready to go shooting, he said casually. He's got plenty of meat, but my uncle might want some. Let me give him a call. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. Just like that. It was one of the smartest things he could have done. The men stood there for a moment confused. Then something must have clicked. They realized what was happening. Maybe they sensed the tension. Maybe they noticed the slight movements in the blinds where I had the rifle trained on them. Whatever it was, it worked. They turned back toward the truck, climbed in without another word and drove off. Slow at first, then faster as they reached the road. Later we learned that the vehicle they were using had been stolen. Not only that, but it was tied to a string of burglaries and break-ins in our area, more than 30 over the previous few months. Some of them had turned violent. People had been hurt. Homes had been trashed. These weren't just drifters or aggressive salesmen. They were predators, and we had narrowly avoided becoming their next victims. The rest of the day was a blur. The adrenaline took hours to wear off. We filed a report, gave statements, and made a few security upgrades around the property. New locks, reinforced doors, a camera near the gate. All things we should have done earlier, but, like most people, we never thought it would happen to us. It's strange how quickly a place you consider safe can feel violated. Our home, the one tucked away from the world, no longer felt isolated in a comforting way. Now it felt exposed, vulnerable. I remember standing on the porch that evening, rifle still within reach, watching the horizon darken. The wind moved through the fields in soft waves, and for a moment I thought I saw movement out near the tree line. My heart jumped. But it was just the wind. Still, that feeling stuck with me for weeks, months even. We never saw those men again, but knowing what we know now, there's no question in my mind about their intent. They saw an empty house, no cars, no sign of adults. They thought we were easy prey, but they were wrong. They underestimated us. They didn't count on a baby-faced blacksmith wielding a hammer like Thor. They didn't expect a rifle waiting just behind the blinds. And they definitely didn't expect a quiet, calculated call to the authorities before they could even make a move. What that day taught me was simple. Evil doesn't always announce itself with a bang. Sometimes it pulls into your driveway in a grey truck and smiles as it asks if your parents are home. So be ready, because you may only get one chance to recognize the danger before it knocks on your door. Story 5. The Landlord and the Locked Doors. There are moments in your life where you look back and realize just how narrowly you escaped something far darker than you understood at the time. You try to frame it as paranoia or exaggerate it in your memory just to make it easier to carry, but deep down you know. You felt it in your bones back then, and it never really left. That cold certainty, that prickling tension, that quiet whisper in the back of your mind that said, "This isn't right." I was 16, old enough to stay home alone, young enough to still feel invincible in a way only teenagers do. We lived in a small, run-down house in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where the closest neighbors were miles away, and the only sounds you'd hear at night were the wind brushing through the trees, the occasional distant bark of a dog, and sometimes, if you were really still, your own heartbeat. It was quiet, too quiet at times, but we were used to it. The house had been a private rental. We didn't own it. My dad and brothers had worked out a deal with the landlord. Manual labor in exchange for reduced rent. They'd help with fencing, yard maintenance, hauling equipment, that sort of thing. The landlord himself lived a couple of miles away, which, out here, might as well have been next door. He wasn't someone we were particularly close with. He always seemed like one of those men who carried a storm behind his eyes, quiet but unpredictable, and though he'd never done or said anything outright threatening, he always gave me a strange feeling, a shadow, just barely out of view. That particular day, my dad and brothers had gone into town. I don't remember why exactly, maybe to pick up supplies, maybe to run errands. Either way, I was home alone, which wasn't unusual. I had my dog outside in the fenced-in yard. He was big, loud, and fiercely loyal. Just having him out there gave me a sense of safety. And inside, I did what any teen would do. I distracted myself. I probably spent hours playing The Sims, headphones around my neck, lazily tapping away at the keyboard, mind in another world. The house was small but cozy, and from my bedroom I had a clear view of the long gravel driveway that curved through the trees up to our front gate. If anyone was coming, I'd hear them. I'd see them. That was always the unspoken security system, the crunch of tires, the approach of dust. It was late afternoon when I noticed a vehicle approaching. Not my dad's, not anyone I recognized. My heart started thudding in that slow, deliberate way it does when your brain is trying to catch up with your instincts. I peeked through the blinds. It was the landlord. Again, not unheard of. He had shown up unannounced before, twice in fact. Both times I was home alone. Both times he'd walked around the outside of the house, looked through windows, checked the fences, and then left. No warning, no text, just appeared. But this time was different. Something felt off. Not just eerie, but wrong. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way he parked too close to the house, or the strange heaviness in the air. Or maybe it was just the way my stomach dropped as he got out and slammed the truck door behind him. I reacted fast. I turned off the lights, shut the blinds, locked every door, triple-checked the windows. The whole house went still. I didn't breathe. I grabbed the largest kitchen knife we had and slipped under the kitchen table, crouching low, listening. My heartbeat was in my ears now, louder than any noise outside. My dog outside was going ballistic, barking and growling with the kind of rage that said this wasn't a familiar face. I heard the landlord shout at him, "Shut up, mutt!" And then the creak of the gate as he let himself in. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Up the porch stairs, across the wooden slats, right to the front door. He tried the handle. I nearly screamed. But the door held. I heard him muttering to himself, something muffled. Then the footsteps moved around the house. He was checking windows again, tapping the glass, trying the back doors, one by one, testing them. Every few minutes, he'd call out my name, not yelling, just loud enough to be heard. Calm. Too calm. Come out, I know you're in there. He kept walking, circling, stopping, starting again. It was a pattern that repeated for what felt like forever. I messaged my dad, fingers trembling. He said they were heading back immediately, but they were nearly an hour away. I was alone. At one point, I crept down the hallway, keeping close to the wall. I could hear him talking, muttering now. But it wasn't nonsense. There was something chilling in his tone, something deliberate. It was like he was rehearsing a conversation, like he was planning something. Then I heard it. "I'm going to burn the house down," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll let you out first." I froze. My blood ran cold. Even now, years later, I still struggle to process that line. At the time, I didn't fully believe him. Part of me thought he was just bluffing, just trying to scare me. But looking back on it now, I realize something much darker. He wanted me to believe it. And more than that, he wanted me to come out. That's what terrifies me the most. What would have happened if I'd stepped outside? The longer he stayed, the more certain I became that this wasn't just a surprise check-in. This wasn't a confused landlord mistaking the day or time. This was something else. Something dangerous, predatory. He was there for nearly an hour. Eventually he left, just like that. No explanation, no goodbye. He got in his truck, slammed the door and drove off down the gravel path. My dog's barking echoed into the silence he left behind. My dad and brothers arrived not long after. I told them everything, every word, every movement. We moved out not long after that. I used to think it was our decision, that we left because it was safer, but now, looking back, I think it may not have been our choice at all. We might have been evicted, quietly, without notice, just removed. We spent nearly a year living in a caravan on my uncle's land after that. It was cramped, uncomfortable, but I never felt safer. I'd take tight quarters and family over isolated walls and shadows any day. One thing that still haunts me is the question I can't answer. How did he know I was home alone? There was no car in the driveway, no sound coming from inside. He hadn't passed my dad on the road. There was no way to know for sure that I was inside, but somehow he knew. Not just that the house was empty, but that I was there, by myself. It wasn't luck, it wasn't coincidence, it was deliberate. I think about that a lot. Sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night and listen for footsteps that aren't there. Sometimes when I catch the sound of gravel outside and feel my breath catch before I realize it's nothing. The house we lived in may be gone now, or maybe it's still there, waiting for the next family, the next girl to be left home alone. But something about that place always felt off. And maybe now I understand why. Maybe places remember things. Maybe they carry the echoes of moments that never made the news, never made it into the open. I haven't seen the landlord since that day. We never reported him. I think part of us just wanted to move on, forget it ever happened. But forgetting doesn't erase it. It just buries it deeper, and sometimes it comes back at night when the wind brushes against the windows and the world is too quiet. I don't sleep near unlocked doors anymore. And I always listen when the dog barks. Story 6, Wings in the Trees. Sometimes a single moment can change the way you see the world forever. Not with some dramatic, earth-shattering event, but with a quiet, haunting encounter that doesn't make sense. One that creeps up from the edges of your memory, reminding you that you once saw something you were never meant to see. Something that doesn't belong in the natural order of things. Something that breaks the rules without ever making a sound. It was 14 years ago when it happened. I remember it like a snapshot, frozen, vivid, burned into the folds of my mind where time doesn't erode things. My friends and I were doing what teenagers often do when they're bored and the world still feels like a playground. We were hanging out in the neighborhood just past dusk when the air still holds some of the warmth from the day and everything feels a little slower, a little softer. We had gotten some pizza and decided to sit on the roof of a friend's car, parked near a wooded area not far from the house. Nothing unusual, just some dumb jokes, crusts tossed to the side, the kind of peaceful evening that slips by unnoticed. Until it didn't. There was a shift, not in the air, not in the temperature, but in the feeling, that subtle, quiet moment when everything just changes. When you stop laughing mid-sentence without knowing why. When the trees, which just moments ago were rustling casually in the breeze, now stand eerily still. No wind, no bugs, no movement. It was the kind of silence that feels intentional, heavy, watching. It was then that we saw it. Far off in the distance, at the edge of the tree line, something was moving, swinging from branch to branch with uncanny ease. It wasn't subtle either. It moved with purpose, large and dark, using the height of the trees to keep itself partially hidden. At first I thought it was just a monkey. Maybe one had escaped from a nearby zoo, although that in itself felt unlikely. We joked about it, nervously, half-heartedly. One of the guys said something about an ape from the local zoo getting loose. We laughed, but it was the kind of laughter people use to fill in fear, to patch over the instinct that tells them something is wrong. We stared longer. The thing stopped moving and hung there gripping a branch, still and silent. And then it looked at us. Even from that distance we could feel it, that kind of attention that doesn't feel human. Its posture shifted. It began to straighten up, Not like an animal, but like a man, its shoulders rolled back, spine elongated, arms folding closer to its sides. Suddenly, what had seemed like an oversized monkey now looked disturbingly human. But not quite human, not completely. It was like watching something transform into a shape it wasn't meant to hold. Then came the part none of us will ever forget. As we watched in silent horror, the creature crouched down slightly, as if preparing to leap. But before it jumped, its back began to shift, slowly at first. Two large masses began rising from its shoulder blades, growing, unfolding. Massive wings. They spread wide with a fluid, unnatural grace, black as night and impossibly large. It didn't flap them. It just jumped from the tree and glided. And in that instant, the spell broke. All of us, every single one, scrambled off the car in sheer panic. We didn't speak. We didn't argue. We just ran, piled into the vehicle, and slammed the doors shut. Someone turned the key and the engine roared to life. We didn't even know where we were driving, only that we had to get away from that place, from those woods, from whatever we had seen. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin, staring at the window. Every time a branch moved or a shadow shifted, I was sure it had followed me home. I was sure it was watching. I still don't know if it did. Over time, the fear faded, but the memory didn't. And what stayed with me most wasn't just the wings or the transformation. It was that feeling. That moment before it looked at us, when the world went still. When something ancient stepped into our ordinary lives and reminded us how little we actually understood. I've done a lot of reading since then, Mothman, skinwalkers, shadow beings. None of it quite fits. This wasn't a ghost or a creature of folklore that people dress up for Halloween. It was something else. Something that doesn't belong on any list or in any mythology. It wasn't evil, not in the way stories often paint these things, but it wasn't neutral either. It was aware. It saw us. It wanted us to see it. And maybe that was the worst part. Because the world never looked quite the same after that. The woods never felt as safe. Silence never felt as peaceful. And shadows, they always seemed to hold a little more shape than they should. We all agreed after some time not to talk about it too much. We feared that if we spoke of it often, we might invite it back. Not that we believed it could hear us, but because, in a way, the memory itself felt alive. Like a door we didn't want to reopen. But still, we think about it. Sometimes when I walk past a tree-lined path, I find myself looking up, wondering if something is perched just beyond sight. Sometimes when I see birds flying low at dusk, I get a strange chill and wonder if I'd know the difference if something else took to the sky among them. There's a part of me that still wants to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe we were overtired, caught in some group hallucination. But that would mean discrediting the sharpness of our memories, the clarity with which we all saw the same exact thing. That would mean turning my back on a truth I know in my bones. That night, in the trees, we saw something real, something with wings, something that was never supposed to be seen. And maybe, just maybe, the world is filled with doors that most of us never walk through. Maybe reality is only as solid as we believe it to be, and when we see through the cracks, when we glimpse what's hiding between the layers, we're left with a choice. Pretend it never happened, or accept that there are things out there that live beyond logic, beyond explanation. Things that watch, things that wait. And sometimes, they fly. Story 7, the basement room and the handprints. 8 years ago, my family and I moved into a house that from the outside looked perfectly ordinary. It was a modest 2-story home nestled in a quiet neighborhood where the lawns were trimmed, the mailboxes stood straight, and the streetlights cast that soft golden glow at night that usually made you feel safe. I was 10 years old then. My 2 sisters were older, 12 and 15 at the time, and our 2 dogs were always with us, wagging tails and bounding energy. We were a normal family. We were happy. At least we were supposed to be. The house itself wasn't old or run down. In fact, it had a warmth to it when we first walked through during the open house. The hardwood floors creaked just enough to feel lived in. The windows let in just the right amount of light, and the backyard had a row of tulips my dad admired immediately. My mum loved the layout. The rooms were a good size, and the basement was partially finished, which meant it could serve as a bedroom, an entertainment area, or just a quiet place to be alone. We moved in quickly, furniture stacked, boxes unpacked, photos hung. It didn't take long before we felt like it was home. But even then, before the dust had settled and the rooms had been filled with laughter and sleep, there were whispers in the corners, little things we didn't talk about. A shadow that moved too quickly across the hallway, a door that didn't stay shut, our dogs suddenly freezing in place and growling at empty walls. It was easy to explain it away. New place, new sounds, old house settling, all those little rationalizations that keep fear from growing roots. The first real sign that something was wrong came from the neighbors. One of them had kids that went to school with my sister, the one who was 12 at the time. During one conversation, almost casually, they mentioned something that made all of us stop. They said the boy who lived in the house before us had taken his own life. In the garage. At first we didn't believe it, or didn't want to, but the neighbor's child didn't say it like it was a rumor. It wasn't dramatic or spooky. It was said plainly, factually, like a piece of information everyone knew but didn't speak about. My sister came home shaken. She told us that the neighbor's kid had mentioned the boy's name, how he was around her age, how it had happened late one night, and how ever since the garage didn't feel right. That night, I stood at the edge of the garage and looked inside. It was empty, aside from boxes and bikes, and still smelled faintly of paint and oil. But there was something else, something cold and still. On the far wall, barely noticeable unless you looked closely, were handprints. Faint, smeared and too high to have been made by someone sitting or crouching. They were up near the top corner, almost as if someone had tried to claw their way up. We told ourselves it was dirt, or maybe paint, but the prints never went away, no matter how much scrubbing was done. My dad tried repainting the wall, twice. Each time within a week the stains came back, lighter, but there. We stopped going into the garage after dark. Over time, the strange things became part of our lives. The basement bedroom, which my sister eventually claimed, became the source of most of the tension. At first, she loved it. It was cool during the summer, private, quiet. But then she started sleeping upstairs more often. She would use excuses at first, too cold, too tired to go down, wanted to talk, but soon she admitted the truth. She didn't feel safe down there. She described it as a heaviness, not all the time, but often enough. A pressure on her chest when she lay in bed, the sensation of being watched, of something standing in the corner just out of sight. At first she thought she was imagining things, but then came the sleep paralysis. Long, terrifying moments where she was frozen in place, unable to speak, her eyes wide open and fixed on the far corner of the room. She would describe what she saw during those episodes in vague, frightened tones. Shadows, always watching. Once, she said it looked like the Babadook, crouched and silent. She wasn't the only one. I started to hear footsteps when I was home alone. Slow, deliberate pacing in the hallway. Our dogs would stand at the base of the stairs and bark at her closed bedroom door, hackles raised, tails low. They refused to go into her room, even when called. Eventually, we stopped trying to get them to. Other little things began happening too. My closet, always neat, would be disturbed. Hangers turned the wrong way, clothes off the floor that I hadn't moved. Once, I watched as a hanger gently swayed back and forth like someone had just brushed past it. No windows were open, no fans were on. I remember standing there, frozen, unable to look away, waiting for something else to move. There were knocks on doors when no one else was home. Faucets that turned on by themselves. Flickering lights. My mum brushed it off, but even she started to avoid being alone in the basement. My dad, the most skeptical of all, would spend long hours in the garage fixing the car or doing woodwork, only to come in quiet and pale, sometimes refusing to talk about what he'd heard or felt. The strangest part, though, was my mum's reaction to the tulips. She had always loved tulips, purple especially. My dad had planted them in the front yard as a gift, and they were her pride and joy. But a few weeks after they bloomed for the first time, I overheard her whispering to my dad. She said she felt guilty for replacing the yellow ones that had been there before. She said the yellow tulips had felt like they belonged to the boy who lived here before us. My dad tried to reassure her, but she just shook her head. "It's like he's still here," she said. "Like we're living in his place." She didn't say much after that, but she started lighting candles more often. She saged the basement. She left a glass of water near the garage door. Years went by, and we stayed in the house. We learned to live with the presence, or perhaps it learned to live with us. The activity never stopped, but it became manageable, predictable even. We knew when the bad nights were coming. The air would feel different, heavy, silent. The dogs would whine. My sister would sleep upstairs. The rest of us would keep the lights on just a little longer. Eventually my sister went to college. When she left, the basement room stayed empty. For a while nothing happened. But then the dreams started. Each of us, one by one, had nightmares. Different in content, but always in the same setting, the basement. The shadows, the door, a presence waiting at the edge of the bed. My sister called home one night crying, saying she had one too. Even miles away, it found her. We never talked about it much, not openly, but there were glances, agreements left unsaid, understanding and silence. We all knew. Something had happened in that house long before we arrived, and something, some small, aching remnant, was still there. Not malevolent, not entirely, but lost, angry. To this day the handprints are still there in the garage, faint but visible. No matter what we tried, they never truly disappeared, just faded, like echoes, like memories trapped in the walls. And sometimes, when I pass by a house for sale with a garage door standing half open, I wonder what stories are hidden in the rooms we don't look at too closely, what spirits linger not to harm, but simply to be remembered. And I wonder if, when we moved in, that boy looked at us not with anger but with sadness, because we were living in the place where he had once lived too. And maybe he was never really ready to leave. Story 8. The Shadow in the Apartment. It was the first time I'd ever lived alone. I was 24, recently out of college, starting my first full-time job, and finally stepping into that phase of adulthood that everyone romanticizes, where you get your own space, decorate how you like, and come home to silence that belongs only to you. The apartment was nothing special. A small third-floor unit in an older building on the edge of the city, hard wood floors that creaked slightly, windows that let in just enough of the skyline to make the rent feel justified, and walls that held the faint scent of whoever had lived there before me. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I moved in on a Thursday. The weather was soft, the air filled with the scent of early spring. My parents helped with the heavy lifting, and by evening the place already looked lived in. Boxes half opened, towels draped over the counters, a futon pushed awkwardly against the far wall. That night, after they left, I stood in the living room and exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the windows tinged with blue. I remember thinking, this is it. My place, my peace. The first few nights were uneventful. I explored the area, bought groceries, learned the quirks of the building. The radiator clicked at odd hours. The plumbing made soft groaning sounds when the upstairs neighbor took late-night showers. The hallway light outside my door flickered from time to time, but it was all manageable. Normal. But by the end of the first week, something changed. It started with small things. I would wake up and find the bathroom door open, even though I always shut it before bed. Or I'd come home and notice that the blinds were tilted differently than I had left them. Once, I found the hallway closet light on, faintly buzzing behind the thin wooden door. I thought maybe I was just adjusting to the space, that I was misremembering things in the rush of this new life. That's what I told myself. Until the night I saw the shadow. It was late. I had fallen asleep on the futon with the television on low. When I woke up, the screen had gone dark, but the backlight was still on, casting a dull blue hue across the room. I sat up slowly, groggy, trying to decide whether to go to bed or just crash where I was. And then I saw it out of the corner of my eye. Something moved near the hallway. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow from a car passing outside, but the streets were quiet. No headlights, no motion. I turned fully to look, and that's when I saw the shape. It wasn't detailed, just a dark, human-sized figure standing perfectly still at the edge of the hallway, not fully formed, like it hadn't quite stepped into this world. No facial features, no clothing, just a black silhouette, dense and thick like smoke that refused to disperse. I didn't move, didn't blink. I just sat there, staring, heart slowly beginning to thud against my ribs. The shadow didn't shift, didn't retreat. It simply stood there, like it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. Then the TV turned off, though not the screen, it had already been dark, but the entire unit powered down with a soft click. The room dimmed further, and when I looked back at the hallway, the shadow was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few weeks, things escalated slowly but surely. I'd wake up to sounds, soft footsteps on the hardwood, whispers I couldn't quite make out, the creak of doors shifting when no one had touched them. I began keeping the lights on at night, not out of fear, at least, that's what I told myself, but out of caution. I convinced myself that the place just had old wiring, drafty windows, loose floorboards, that the noises were natural, that the shadow was stress, exhaustion, imagination. But the feeling never left, the feeling that I wasn't alone. One night, I invited a friend over. I didn't say anything about the shadow. I didn't want to sound paranoid. We were watching a movie, laughing, eating takeout. It was normal, easy. And then, in the middle of a sentence, she stopped talking. Her eyes froze, focused over my shoulder. "Who's in your hallway?" she whispered. I turned instantly. No one, just the hallway, empty, dim. "No one," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's just us." She looked at me carefully. "I swear, I saw someone standing there." I laughed it off, but my hands were shaking. Later that night, after she left, I stood in that hallway for a long time, just stood there, breathing, waiting, listening. There was nothing, but the air felt thick, the kind of thick that fills your lungs with dread, like walking through fog that doesn't want you there. Eventually I did some research, not on ghosts or spirits, but on the building. I looked up old records, news articles, tenant reviews. I didn't expect to find anything, but then I came across a forum post. Someone who had lived in my unit 2 years before. The thread was short, barely a paragraph, but the final sentence made my blood run cold. I moved out because of the hallway. I never felt safe walking past it at night, and I swear to this day I saw a man standing there watching me, just watching, night after night. I never finished reading the replies. I closed the laptop and sat in silence for a long time. After that I started sleeping with a small nightlight, a ridiculous little plug-in thing shaped like a moon. I thought maybe the soft glow would push back whatever darkness had been inching closer. I began leaving salt at the threshold of the hallway, sage. I don't even know why, just things I read online. I wasn't religious, I wasn't superstitious, but when you live with something you can't explain, you start to try anything. You hope maybe belief itself is enough. The final incident came 2 months later. I had just gotten home from work, arms full of groceries. The sun had barely gone down and the apartment was quiet. I set the bags down on the counter and turned toward the hallway, and there he was, the shadow. Closer than ever, not just a vague silhouette anymore, taller than me, head slightly tilted, arms long and still. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The room felt frozen, like time had stopped, like the world was waiting. Then, slowly, the figure stepped backward into the dark. 1 step, 2, and disappeared. I moved out 2 weeks later, found a different place, paid more than I could afford, but I didn't care. I just needed to sleep again, to breathe without fear, to turn off the lights without bracing for something to emerge. I never saw the shadow again, but sometimes, even now, I'll wake up at night in my new apartment and glance toward the hallway and feel it, that familiar tightness, that hush, like something is still watching, like the darkness remembers me, even if I try not to remember it. I've never gone back to that building. I don't even drive past it. Some places don't forget, and some shadows, they wait.